نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So inshallah, just mention a point or two to conclude last week's topic. So last week's topic was zakat, and we don't want to go further into detail. We'll just mention a couple points that were missed out on last week. So the first was zakat on behalf of the deceased. Right? So if a person passes away and they have some zakat that's left over that they have not paid for, so what is the way forward with this? So if a person has not paid their zakat, right, and they pass away, then this responsibility does not fall on anyone else. Right? This responsibility, in a sense, you can say, dies with the person. The only scenario in which you will further go and pay and try to fulfill this person's zakat is in the case if this deceased person, he had written down in his will, right, in his wasiyah, he had written that I had such an amount, he has this calculated amount of zakat written, and he says that this amount is left over of my zakat to be paid, and I bequest my people, my inheritors, whoever is in charge of the estate, to fulfill this amount. Now in this scenario, the amount will not be paid from the entire estate. Alright, so for example, if the person has $100,000 in his legacy, and his zakat to be paid is $50,000, right, and he requests that the full $50,000 be paid. Right, so the full $50,000 will not be paid. In this scenario, only 1/3 of his entire estate will be used. Right? Now there's a difference between this and the normal type of debts, right? These are debts that a person owes to people, and there's the debt of zakat that a person owes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now because the debt a person owes is something that it's, for example, I owe a debt, it is my responsibility to fulfill it. Right? I can't use someone else's money to fulfill my debts. Right? So when a person passes away, his money is no longer his. Right? All the money that we use in this dunya is given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a limited amount of time. When we pass away, it's not ours. Right? So the money that's left behind, it does not belong to me, it belongs to my inheritors, and in the absence of my inheritors, it belongs to the Baytul Mal. So my debts that I need to pay cannot be paid from someone else's money. So the money that I leave behind, normally, you can't use that money to pay off the debts. But because the debts with the exception of 1/3, right, up to 1/3, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has given, that leeway, that up to 1/3 of your leftover wealth, you can give wasiyat and you can spend how you want to. Up to 1/3 of your leftover wealth. But when it comes to the debts of people, when it comes to money I owe other people, because other people's haqq is attached to it, that's why we allow that the entire debt can be covered. So if I have $100,000 left in my estate and I owe some person $50,000, then the full $50,000 will be paid because a person's haqq is attached to it. But if this same amount is owed in zakat, then the full amount will not be paid. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not muhtaj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need our money. So again, in this scenario, if a person makes a wasiyah that his zakat be paid, then you will only use up to 1/3 of the amount of his estate to pay off his zakat. If that 1/3 amount is enough, then khair, alhamdulillah. If it is not enough, then you'll use that 1/3 amount and the rest will be left. The rest of the zakat will not be fulfilled. Unless, of course, any one of the inheritors or family members wishes to do so voluntarily, in which case, of course, they have permission to do so. But no one will be asked to, and no one will be asked to give up their haqq, which is their own right in the estates that's left behind. This was the one mas'ala that we wanted to cover, and the other is the Zakaat al-Fitr. Right, so it comes in one hadith, عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما قال فرض رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صدقة الفطر طهرة للصائم من اللغو والرفث وطعمة للمساكين. Right, so the hadith says that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he made Zakaat al-Fitr, he made it compulsory upon the Muslims as a type of cleansing for the people that were fasting. Right, it's a cleansing from them for whatever mistakes they may have made, and it's a way to feed the poor. And the hadith goes further, فَمَنْ أَدَّاهَا قَبْلَ الصَّلَاةِ فَهِيَ زَكَاةٌ مَقْبُولَةٌ. If a person pays it off before the salah, then it is accepted as a zakat. وَمَنْ أَدَّاهَا بَعْدَ الصَّلَاةِ فَهِيَ صَدَقَةٌ مِنَ الصَّدَقَاتِ. Now it is, Zakaat al-Fitr is wajib on those people who own the nisab amount on the morning of Yawm al-Fitr. On the morning of Eid al-Fitr, meaning when the sun comes up, when the time of Fajr sets in, Subh Sadiq, at that time, if a person is owner of nisab amount, then Zakaat al-Fitr becomes wajib upon him. But this nisab amount is not the same as the zakat nisab. And how it differs is that in zakat, for a person to be considered wealthy, right? For a person to be considered ghani, sahib nisab, in zakat, a person will calculate whatever wealth he has that is extra and superfluous and beyond his normal needs, beyond his, his own personal belongings, in terms of cash, in terms of cattle, and in terms of business assets, right? He will add these up, and if they equal the threshold of zakat, whether you take the gold or silver amount, if it equals the threshold of zakat, then this person is considered wealthy and he has to pay zakat. But you don't count his personal belongings. Right? That's the nisab for zakat. Right? That's the threshold and the benchmark for zakat. But as for Zakaat al-Fitr, it's a bit different. In Zakaat al-Fitr, you will actually count his personal belongings. Meaning his personal belongings that are not part of his necessities. So for example, if a person has everything he needs to live, but he doesn't have extra spending money, right? He has enough to make ends meet, he has enough to support his family, day by day he's surviving, but he doesn't have extra money equal to nisab. Right? He doesn't have cash, he doesn't have cattle, and he doesn't have any business assets, he doesn't have any goods, commodities for tijarat, for trade. But what he does have is he has an extra car, right? One car is considered your necessity, your need. Everyone needs a car, a house, basic furniture in the house. But if a person has 2 or 3 cars, right? He has extra cars that he's not using, but he's not selling them either. They're his own personal cars. They're his own personal belongings. Right? Now obviously these cars are going to be above the threshold of the zakat amount. Now this person who has no cash, no cattle, and no commodities, he does not pay zakat. Right? This person does not pay zakat because he does not have actual money of the zakat amount. Whatever he has is his own personal belongings, and none of that is zakatable. However, this person does pay Zakaat al-Fitr. Right? Because in Zakaat al-Fitr, you do count his personal belongings. Right? And the same goes for Qurbani. When it comes for the time of Eid al-Adha, then he will also be paying the udhiyah, and this person cannot accept zakat. Right? So this is a different type of threshold. Right? This person will pay Zakaat al-Fitr, he will perform the udhiyah, the qurbani, and he cannot accept zakat. Right? So other examples, for example, if a person has a second house that he's renting out, right? So you don't pay zakat on that house, but this also means that he will have to pay Zakaat al-Fitr. Right? We gave it the example of the extra car that he might have had. Similar things are, for example, if he has electronics, he has a TV set, he has a video, he has a DVD machine, he has even ornaments in a person's cabinet, right? Sometimes these ornaments can be quite expensive, and if the ornaments he has in a display cabinet, if they reach the threshold of zakat, then also they will count these. And also another example is for a person inherits books. Right? Now even if I might not be using these books, maybe these books are in another language, maybe these books are in a field that I don't study, but you can ask college students, sometimes books are very expensive. Right? And sometimes these books might even reach the threshold of zakat. So all of these things will be considered in this zakat. Now when a person pays Zakaat al-Fitr, they will pay on their own behalf. Obviously I pay for myself, my own Zakaat al-Fitr, and you pay for your young children, for non-baligh children. Right? So children that have not reached the age of puberty, you pay for yourself and you pay for your children. Right? You are not responsible to pay for your spouse, and you are not responsible to pay for your baligh children, right? For your elderly children. Now if a person wants to pay for them, right, as normally the father of the house sometimes they take care of the entire house, they just pay on behalf of everyone, the best is to take their permission. Right? They should know, your wife should know, or your child should know that you're paying the Zakaat al-Fitr on their behalf. Right? 1, in terms of the fiqh, they should know, and 2, in terms of their own responsibility as far as their tarbiyat. They should know that this is an obligation upon them. Right? So the best would be to tell them that, can I pay the Zakaat al-Fitr on your behalf? They give you permission. But if a person doesn't ask, if you don't ask your spouse or you don't ask your child, and you just simply pay it on their behalf without asking. Then also it's fine if it's generally understood that the father of the house normally covers all the expenses, right? If that's something that's understood in the house, and you also then go forward and cover the Zakat al-Fitr on behalf of the family, then also it's fine, right? It'll count, but it's better to let them know. The Zakat al-Fitr is, as we mentioned, it becomes fard or wajib on the day of Eid. So it's mustahab to be paid before the Eid Salah, right? If you want to pay even before the day of Eid, this is also sahih, right? It's also fine. And if a person waits and the day passes and he doesn't pay and Eid is gone and Ramadan is over and everything is finished and he still hasn't paid his Zakat al-Fitr, it still remains lazim and it still remains compulsory on a person to pay their Zakat al-Fitr. It does not fall off, right? Just like Zakat, just because you don't pay Zakat doesn't mean it falls off. You still have to pay it. Right? So similarly, Zakat al-Fitr also needs to be paid. Now one question that comes up is, how much is Zakat al-Fitr to be paid? Now often what happens is many of the masajid, they stipulate an amount. Now there's different amounts that are set by different masajid, and generally the amount that's mentioned is quite high. Right? So for example, the Bansiri mentions $12. $12 is quite high. If we go into the kitabs, they mention that Rasulullah ﷺ taught us to either pay a certain unit, it's called a sa', either half a sa' of wheat flour or a full sa' of raisins or of dates or barley flour of that sort. Now if a person were to actually go to Walmart, for example, in a grocery store and check the price of wheat flour, right? So a person can probably go to Walmart and get 2 pounds of wheat flour for $1. Half a sa' could probably be covered in about $4. Right? But when it comes to these types of sadaqat, when it comes to charity, one rule that we learn, that we follow, is that often we do what's anfa' lil fuqara. And what that means is that when you have multiple opinions, when you have different opinions amongst the ulama of what amount is to be paid, then sometimes it's best to go with that which is most beneficial for the poor. Right? This is a rule that we learn, that what is anfa' lil fuqara, what is most beneficial for the poor, then often we can take that opinion. Right? So if a person wants to end up paying extra, then that's fine, and inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward them. So these were just the last concluding remarks we wanted to make on zakat. Moving on to today's topic, it comes in one hadith, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يخص العشر الأواخر من رمضان بأعمال لا يعملها في بقية الشهر. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the meaning of this hadith comes from Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to have in the last 10 days of Ramadan some certain actions and some certain a'mal that he did not have in the rest of the month. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in the last 10 days, in the last 10 nights, used to make an extra concerted effort and an extra strive and used to do certain ibadat that he didn't do in the rest of Ramadan. Right? So we wanted to speak more about i'tikaf, and one way to do amal on this hadith. Right? We always talk about wanting to follow the sunnah and wanting to bring alive the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So part of this sunnah, as we learned from this hadith, is to go further and to try harder in the last 10 days of Ramadan. Right? So one way that we can do this is by involving ourselves in i'tikaf. Now i'tikaf is the crux of ibadat. Right? A person, what the ulama often describe it as, is a person goes and he puts himself at the doorstep, right? A person who has a very severe need. When he goes to someone and he begs them and he says that I can't leave until you fulfill this for me. So this is the example of the person that goes to i'tikaf. He goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and each and every single one of us has a very severe need. Each and every single one of us is desperate that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives us, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our actions, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to enter Jannah. We are desperate for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. Each and every one of us has this need. So a person goes in i'tikaf and he goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he sits at his house and he says, I can't leave until you forgive me. I can't leave until you promise your mercy for me. Right? So this kind of amal is taking place. Right? And I've heard one friend of mine, he describes it as an ICU unit. Right? A person who's in a very difficult condition, a person who might be about to die. then what does he do? He's sent to the emergency room and he stays there and he's not allowed to leave, and the doctors are constantly on him 24/7. Right? This is the example of the person who's in i'tikaf. Now the person recognizes that I'm in a halat, I'm in a condition and I need severe help. So he puts himself in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's care and he involves himself in his ibadat, and spiritually he is doing the correct exercises. He's taking a spiritual treatment. Like we would go to a hospital for medical treatment, a person goes into i'tikaf for spiritual treatment. Right? I'tikaf is something that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam never left out, and this is mentioned in many narrations. That Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would always do the i'tikaf in the last 10 days of Ramadan. And normally, something that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam had mu'adhabat, something that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam performed perpetually, something that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam never left out. Normally these things are considered wajib. Right? But the i'tikaf is not considered wajib. It's considered sunnah muakkada. It's a very strong sunnah, and it's sunnah ala al-kifaya, meaning if a few people in the community are performing their i'tikaf, then it suffices for the rest of the community. Right? But it goes to show that the i'tikaf is not something to be taken lightly. Right? It's something that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made sure that he didn't leave out. Right? Even though there was no rebuke if a sahabi were to leave out the i'tikaf. Right? There was no malamat, there was no scolding on him, of course, and so that's why it's not wajib. But it was a very strong sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And a person who's given this opportunity of i'tikaf, right? It's a very, very special privilege from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we come on Qiyamah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give a person their book of deeds, you'll see the person's book of deeds will be full of pages, and many of them will be darkened and blackened, and many of them will be dirty pages. But in that book of deeds you might find a few pages, 10 certain pages that might be shining and gleaming and might be pages of gold. These days are those days. These days are those pages that a person comes on Qiyamah, he can open those pages and be proud of something in his kitab. That he can see something in his kitab, that something stands out. These are the days Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a special mercy. Right? So we want to fill our book of deeds with something worth looking at. Right? These are the days to do that. When a person comes in this masjid, he comes with a maqsad. He comes with a gharaz. He comes with a desire. He comes here, he puts his body in this masjid, that I'm going to stick here and I'm going to stay here. He puts his heart into it, that I'm not going to leave the ibadat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when a person comes for i'tikaf and he stays in the masjid, part of the etiquette is that a person should be constantly involved in ibadat. Right? A person shouldn't come to the masjid in the month of Ramadan and then spend time doing something else. Right? He should not be on his phone, should not be talking to people. As far as possible, right? If a person wants the treatment to work, then he has to take his medicine, right? We always tell people they shouldn't skip their meds. A person comes to the masjid, he should not be skipping their ibadat. A person should be completing their tasbihat, to complete the zikr, to complete the tilawat of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Nashr, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. Right? That when a person becomes farigh, when a person has free time, when a person does all their work that they need to do, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ, then stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. Right? And have a raghbat, have a desire, and strive towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we just want to mention a few ahkam, and inshallah we won't take too long. So what is the sunnah i'tikaf? The sunnah i'tikaf, because there are different types of i'tikaf. There's nafil i'tikaf, there's wajib i'tikaf. The nafil i'tikaf is simply a person is in the masjid and they make niyat of i'tikaf. Right? So all of us right now can make the niyat of i'tikaf. And a person, whenever they enter the masjid, they should always make the niyat of nafil i'tikaf. Nafil i'tikaf starts when you enter the masjid and it ends when you leave the masjid. Right? This is the nafil i'tikaf. But the sunnah i'tikaf that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would perform was the last 10 days and nights of Ramadan. Right? So a person stays in the masjid area. For women also, they can do it at home in a hujra, in some room that they have in their house. They can also perform this i'tikaf. Now when a person is in i'tikaf, a person needs to be fasting and a person needs to make a niyat. Right? As far as nafil i'tikaf, those conditions aren't there. Right? You don't need to be fasting, you don't need to be there for the whole day. But for sunnah i'tikaf, you need to make the niyat. Meaning if, for example, if someone to keep you prisoner in the masjid and you had no niyat of i'tikaf, then you wouldn't get the reward of i'tikaf. Right? There needs to be a niyat. Right? Which generally is there, right? You don't really need to worry about it. A person comes with his wedding to the masjid, that's considered a niyat. So one is the niyat, and secondly, a person needs to be fasting for the i'tikaf to take place. Now, in terms of when a person is allowed to leave the masjid, normally a person is only allowed to leave the masjid for necessity, right? And necessity would basically mean to, for example, use the restroom. And that's about it. Every other need can be taken care of inside the masjid. If a person needs to sleep, it can be done in the masjid. If a person needs to eat and drink, it can be done in the masjid. Right? As long as the person has the niyat of i'tikaf, he can do these things. Normally we don't do these things in the masjid, but if a person is in i'tikaf, then he's allowed to do these things in the masjid. So the ulama are often quite strict actually in what is allowed for a person to leave the masjid. Because if a person leaves the masjid without any reason, without any excuse, then their i'tikaf is broken, even if he leaves forgetfully. Right? Unlike fasting, where if a person eats forgetfully or drinks forgetfully, then their fast is not broken. But that's not the same for i'tikaf. In i'tikaf, if a person leaves forgetfully even, then his i'tikaf is broken. So the rule is that if you leave the masjid for a true necessity, right, then you are to immediately return to the masjid as soon as you are done. But if while you are outside the masjid, you involve yourself in ibadah, then your i'tikaf is not broken. So if you leave the masjid, for example to use the restroom, and you stay outside the masjid for longer than necessary, then this will break a person's i'tikaf. But if a person leaves the masjid to use the restroom, and then he stays outside to perform an ibadah, then the person's i'tikaf will not break. So for example, if a person goes to use the restroom, he performs wudu, and he joins the janazah salah, for example. Right? This is an ibadah. So this is something that a person can do and then return to the masjid, and his i'tikaf will be valid. Now, many people, they ask about performing a ghusl, whether it's on a Friday or on a normal day, and they want to perform a ghusl. Are they allowed to leave the masjid for the shower? So, for this, a person, what he can do is he can go out of the masjid with the niyat of using the restroom and making wudu. And because the ghusl on Friday is a sunnah action, it is considered an ibadah, then they can quickly perform a ghusl as well. And according to some opinions, to perform a ghusl on the odd nights is also a mustahab action. So this also will be considered an ibadah. So inshallah, in this way a person can perform his ghusl as well. This is kind of the easy way out. Right? But generally the rule is if you're outside of the masjid and you're not performing an ibadah, then this breaks the i'tikaf. Just one last thing we want to mention about the i'tikaf. We know that a person can eat in the masjid, he can sleep in the masjid. If a person is performing the sunnah i'tikaf, he's also allowed to perform business transactions in the masjid, which in our time isn't needed as much, but in those times it was. So he can perform business in the masjid as needed for his family, right? But it's still makruh for him to actually bring products into the masjid and to display them in the masjid, right? All of that is not needed, and it's not the place. The masjid is not the place for that. Right? And as far as possible, a person should avoid speaking about dunya. Right? A person comes to the masjid, a person comes with this niyat, this month of Ramadan, a person should be constantly conscious of what he's doing here. Right? It's not to say that it's impermissible to speak about dunya. A person can, sometimes for a person to relax themselves or for a person to make someone else feel comfortable. You can speak about dunya. Right? But our point is to minimize as much as possible. You only get 10 days out of the whole year. Right? And these are very special days. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give all of us tawfiq to come and spend these days in the masjid, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of us. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah.